let's start off with what the motivation was behind doing this study.
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start, and what we were really trying to do with this study and with the center, I think more broadly, is get a better sense of working class voter preferences and political beliefs, and that's something that we have information about from previous elections. Although it can be hard to really dig into voter preferences from election results, and we've got a lot of conflicting information, both within, I think, progressive intuitions about how working class voters behave and what they believe. And also, I'm more on the social science side too, so there's a lot of conflicting information there. So we wanted to design something to really give us a window into working class voter preferences, and I think that's what we got.
What was different about this study than from other? I mean, there's polls all the time. People be polling all the time. What was different and unique about this?
Yes, there are a lot of polls, and you have a lot of ways to get this information. What we really wanted to do was, I think, get as close as you can get to a real election style scenario. So this meant a couple of things. We tried to, so basically what respondents to our survey saw, and these were respondents coming from, we had 2,000 voters in the sample, not just voters, 2,000 working class people in our sample across five different swing purple states. So that's really good to know. And those states were Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. So these are really always crucial battleground states for Democrats, and then looking very specifically at working class voters in those states. So what our survey respondents saw were head-to-head matchups. So they were looking at two different candidates and picking between those two. And the features they saw of these candidates, I think this was really what sets our study apart from what's been done previously, and approaches to sort of studying behavior in this way. So people saw, kind of generic demographic information, the race and gender of the candidate. We also had a number of different so worker category, so occupational status. So we had some CEOs. We saw how CEOs did compared to more working class candidates like teachers, construction workers. And then we gave a couple of different measures that actually got people to sort of have the most robust understanding of what a candidate stood for. So this included a bundle of issues, so sort of looking like a platform. So there were 3 different issues focused on the economy, so looking at jobs in the economy, healthcare, and then racial justice and sort of social justice was that final plank. And then we had a day one priority. So not only what's on this candidate's agenda, but what are they going to get started about immediately, to sort of give some variation there. And that's, I think, a place where we saw got some really interesting results there. And then the final piece, we had a sound bite. So we pulled these from, we created these based on actual quotes from politicians in the last 2 years, candidates and politicians. We can talk a little bit more. I don't want to say too much here, but we can dig more into the sound bites and how we made those. So this was how we sort of set this up, and then gave respondents the opportunity to pick between these candidates in sort of thousands of these head-to-head matchups.
Yeah, I'm curious about the findings regarding their day one priorities. What really stood out to you in those results?
So I think a really important thing that stands out here is that for the sort of really progressive jobs programs, and especially Medicare for all, we saw those are actually really popular positions, especially with the Democratic leaners, the Democratic partisans, and the Democratic leaners in the sample. Slightly less so among the independents and Republican leaners, but those platforms are just overwhelmingly they're popular. I think Medicare for all somewhat more so than Jobs for All, possibly because that's not as well known as a platform as it could be. So I think that's the biggest real takeaway, is that these these economic programs, bread and butter programs, are really popular among these voters and non-voters.
There was a lot of pushback on wokeism, which is, it's in the discourse now, which respondents differentiated from social justice. Can you expand on that finding?
Sure. So I think here it's really one thing that's important, I think, that again is a value of our study and being able to parse, is a lot. So the sort of wokeism and what we called, what we used that sort of descriptor for was in setting up these sound bites. So if you go and look at the report, you can sort of see the differences, but really what we're describing is a campaign style. So I think we can disagree about whether it's effective, but I think that it is a campaign style that's in use by many candidates, including many progressive candidates, although we also included sort of a more woke, moderate frame is what we call that, which was modeling something like, think about Kamala Harris's campaign style. So I think the pushback there is about that frame, but really we're interested in what kind of resonance does this approach that many progressive candidates are taking have with working class voters. And we found, I think sort of across the board, we found that it's more pronounced with certain groups. But that sort of woke approach is less popular than than what we were looking at as the populist progressive rhetoric. So that's based on something like Bernie Sanders, that this country belongs to us all, not just the rich, not just the elite. So that was really a difference. But I think if I can just say one more quick thing, looking at the campaign, the platform, and those issues. There we had what we saw, which I think is a really positive and important finding. There's a lot of support among the respondents to this survey for ending systemic racism and for racial justice being a part of this democratic package, which we think speaks to the fact that this has become very well incorporated into the Democratic Party message. It's something that's broadly supported by workers, and not at all a liability when that's part of the campaign message.
What I appreciated was how the study didn't just look at the working class as a monolith. It got into, the differences between the workers, the nature of the work they do, whether it's manual or blue collar, or their level of income. Can you, weigh in on that a little bit?
Sure.
Like some of the findings of that?
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. So this is actually something we're also looking to do more with in our future research, right? So one of the things that we were trying to do in the survey was not just sort of rely on a single dimension of class, socioeconomic status, education level. Those are really hard, and you miss a lot when you just focus on something like that. So exactly as you're saying, what we tried to build in were other alternative measures, like whether you supervise someone in your job, whether your work is primarily creative or whether it's more manual. So I think those kinds of distinctions, which we discuss a lot more in the report, and then actually going through and analyzing how those different kinds of ways to cut and view this class dimension affected it. So just one thing to give you a sense of one of the things I think that's most striking that we saw that blue collar workers, for example, are much more sensitive than other respondents in our survey to the kind of rhetoric that's being used. So they were very responsive and very supportive of populist rhetoric. I think more so than other voters in the population, where sort of the woke, both progressive and moderate positions were less popular among blue collar workers. But this populist rhetoric was extremely popular among respondents.
You are a social scientist. You study this kind of stuff. This is what you dedicated your life to. Were you surprised by the results, or were you like, no, this is because I'm an expert and because I've studied this, this is what I expected? What were your personal impressions?
Well, I'll say I am a social scientist. Most of the time I'm wearing a hat of a very different kind of research. I do largely historical work. So for me, like looking at the New Deal, that should be an argument that we need these bold economic programs to bring working class voters into the Democratic Party. But we need more information than that as well. So I think I'll say, two of the findings that I think are surprising or maybe most useful to us in thinking about how to organize moving forward. One, sort of this idea that the Democratic label really hurts progressives, or it's really a turnoff among non-voters, among working class voters. We didn't find support for that in our study. So the Democratic label is not something that's hurting candidates. So I think that's one important, potentially sort of surprising finding. And then I think the other sort of progressive idea that our study provided some evidence to the counter is that that the sort of automatic progressive idea that there's just this, among non-voters, there's just this group of working class voters that are waiting to get the message. And so all we have to do is increase turnout, and that's going to really improve outcomes for progressive candidates. Now, that's probably true. What we found is that that's likely true for Democratic candidates. Increasing turnout is going to benefit Democratic candidates on the whole, but it's not necessarily true for progressive candidates. And what we think that means is this is still an organizing project. This is still something that non-voters, working class non-voters look a lot like working class voters. They split in really similar ways, and that means that reaching them and pulling them into this kind of coalition is going to take the same kind of large organizing effort.
A study like this really helps to further analyze what happened in the country in 2016, because one of the more dominant messages coming from Donald Trump was this, closed border, anti-immigrant messaging, which Democrats really tried to take advantage of in their campaigning, thinking that it would really speak to Americans and really convince Americans that Trump would be awful for the country. But there was a pretty surprising finding in regard to immigration messaging in the survey as well. Can you elaborate on that?
I would. Which exactly were you pointing to?
So in regard to priorities, issues that the respondents prioritized, it seemed like immigration was at the bottom of that list.
Yeah. So
if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And really, I think that is one of my takeaways from the study too, which is Trumpism, for those who were surprised in 2016 by the popularity of Trumpism or continue to be surprised. I think really the emphasis and the popularity of, among our survey of this more populist rhetoric and framing, which I think is one of our strongest findings, that really is something that helps us, I think, understand and explain the motivation of some of these workers and why Donald Trump was appealing. Now, we're pointing and attaching that kind of rhetoric to a very different political program and political agenda. But I think you're right. For issues like immigration, these still are really hard. These can be really hard issues for workers to run on. There's a really great piece. There's a really great piece that I always like to assign to my students in thinking about analyzing the 2016 election by Christian Parenti, a scholar at John Jay, looking at he did the hard work of going through and listening to I think just hours of information and stump speeches from Trump's 2016 run, and sort of looked at this emphasis on this immigration, which is really connected to this jobs question of wanting, feeling like they've been left behind in the economy and not understanding this focus. So I think, yeah, we did see, I think, some of that here. I think immigration, I don't want to say too much more because I do think this is somewhere we want to sort of pull, there's only so much we're able to do in one survey like this. And this is definitely an area we want to push forward and look more into.
Well, that's my next question. What's next? If you had $1 billion to do unlimited research, what are you spending it on the next study? What do you want to look into?
So I think we will have some more. I think there are questions that we've come up with here. We have some more sort of to the question about this multidimensional version of class. We do have some more academic style work that's looking at that measure. That's not very exciting. I shouldn't have led with that. I think to me, the more exciting projects that we're headed towards, one, we have a candidate database that we're trying to build. So really, this is pulling, I think, exactly the kinds of dimensions we focused on in the survey, looking at issue areas and platforms, looking at candidate messaging, and actually trying to get a better sense of what's the sort of scope and universe of progressive candidates, and sort of, figure out, I think, learn more about that. Me as the more qualitative researcher, I think that's kind of where I'm looking, but we also do hope to field more studies. I think this study has taught us a lot about the kinds of things that we want to be measuring and diving more into. I think you're pointing to particular issue areas like immigration that we weren't able to explore potentially as fully as we might want to in the study.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.